It is now my honor to introduce today's guest, Dr. Rob Havers. Dr. Havers became president and CEO of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library in February 2019. He came to his post from his previous position as president of the George C. Marshall Foundation in Lexington, Virginia. Dr. Havers served as the executive director of the National Churchill Museum and vice president for the Churchill Institute at Westminster College, located in Fulton, Missouri. He has held positions as a Fulbright Robinson Visiting Scholar of British History at Westminster College, as a professor of war studies at Sandhurst, and is taught at the London School of Economics and Political Science and University of Cambridge. An accomplished scholar, Dr. Havers is the author of several articles and books, and we are thrilled to have you with us today, sir. To begin our discussion together, I'd like to ask you, as you know, tomorrow is the 76th anniversary of the monumental Allied landing in Normandy. And why do you think it's important to mark this anniversary?
Linda, let me say thank you very much for the invitation to speak today with you and to your audience. As you rightly said, I've been president of the Museum and Library for a little over a year, and one of the first other cultural institutions that I visited was the Illinois Holocaust Museum. Very impressive organization and institution, and certainly keeps the memory and history alive in a very dynamic fashion. So pleasure to be here. Your question tomorrow, you're absolutely right, the 76th anniversary of those monumental Allied landings in Normandy. Had things gone according to plan, of course, today would have been the 76th anniversary. Obviously that 24-hour postponement necessitated by poor weather, but 1 year ago, the whole of the world, in some sense, was marking that 75th anniversary. Many of those who participated, obviously, in those landings are no longer with us. And so key anniversaries such as 25, 50, and 75 milestones are very important. 76, obviously, is a less recognized anniversary, but certainly to my mind, and I think probably anyone involved in public history believes that it is always important to mark significant events from the past, even if 76th anniversaries are less celebrated and less widely denoted than 75th. And the reasons behind that, I think, are quite simple, that as the years recede and as those familiar with the actual events pass away, and events such as this fall from that which is within living memory, so the importance, in a sense, of marking these dates becomes even more important and not less important. Also, I think any opportunity to remind the contemporary world about what happened and how the contemporary world in which we live in grew from those events in the past is important, because sadly, historical knowledge seems to be diminishing amongst the wider population rather than growing for a whole host of reasons. But I think public history institutions such as the Illinois Holocaust Museum and the Pritzker Military Museum and Library have a special duty to mark historical events in this fashion. And appetite for an understanding of where we came from and in marking the past is a basic, I think, preoccupation of humanity. So even if, as we like to say, history isn't taught as thoroughly in schools as perhaps it once was, that's an opportunity for public history organizations. So it's very important. 76 years ago today, or 76 years ago tomorrow rather, those landings occurred on the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy. Very important to, even for a moment, just pause and think about the sacrifice, the courage, and what was at stake, really.
Thank you for that. We at the museum could not agree with you more. That is the hallmark of why we exist, to remember the past and to use it to teach universal values and strengthen things. So thank you for that. And you just said what was at stake. So what was at stake with the Normandy landings? Can you help us understand that?
I think looking back, it is very tempting to see history as a continuum of cause and effect, and the old cliche that hindsight is 20/20 is absolutely true. It's very tempting to conclude that it was a formality, that Nazi Germany would be defeated decisively, that good would triumph over evil. The Normandy landings, obviously a key component of that. But had things gone differently, the world in which we live could have well been a very different place. And fundamentally, I think, and in all probability, the very outcome of the war was at stake 76 years ago tomorrow, and indeed perhaps the future of civilization. If that is the case, then the stakes really do not get much more substantial than that. Had the Allied landings, the Western Allies landings on the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy been a failure, and we're all familiar with Eisenhower's famous letter that he wrote, hoping never to read out, about accepting responsibility for the failed landings. Had the landings failed, had the Western Allies not been able to establish that crucial foothold in France, then the Soviet Union would have continued to face Nazi Germany on the continent of Europe, face Nazi Germany alone, and in all probability the full weight then of German efforts could reasonably have shifted eastward. And as the time necessary for the Western Allies to rebuild their strength, to replan another Operation Overlord, to try again, that in almost all certainty would have allowed the Germans, Nazi Germany, an enormous breathing space. Some conjecture about when had Overlord been a failure, when the British and the Americans and the Canadians, when another landing of the magnitude of Overlord could have been put together, probably not until nearer the end of 1945. So would that have meant that Nazi Germany could have defeated the Soviet Union? Almost certainly not. I think the die by June of 1944 was largely cast in the East, but it would certainly have made the prospect of a separate peace between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany more of a possibility. And we need only cast our minds back a few decades earlier than 1944 to the First World War, when successive Russian revolutions resulted in then Imperial Russia dropping out of the First World War and allowing then Imperial Germany to shift her forces from the east to the west to face the Allies in far greater strength on the Western Front. So this is all conjecture. Who knows what could and would have happened, but it would have been a monumental disaster for the Western Allies. Maintaining, and in any democracy, maintaining the commitment of the people to prosecute a war on the scale of World War II was an ever-present consideration, something that FDR and Winston Churchill thought a lot about. Faced with that kind of defeat, it's a substantial knock to take and a substantial effort to stand up again.
Can you share a bit about Churchill's role in the planning of D-Day, and how long did it take to plan that?
Yes, certainly. Winston Churchill, as you all know, British Prime Minister during World War II, undoubtedly his finest hour. Curiously, Winston Churchill wears two hats. He has two roles in the Second World War. Firstly, obviously, he is British Prime Minister, but he also holds simultaneously the role of Minister of Defense, a title that, or a position analogous to the United States Secretary of Defense. Churchill, who had served in World War I, initially as the First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the Royal Navy at the outbreak of that conflict, and then later as Minister of Munitions, charged with ensuring that the logistics that fed the British Army and some Allied armies were all in good order. He spent the time in the trenches as a lieutenant colonel as well. Churchill had held these roles in World War I, and he had seen the disconnect, as he understood it, between the political direction and decisions and also the military direction of the war. Having experienced this firsthand in World War I, in World War II, he determined to remedy this by essentially wearing these two hats: Prime Minister, in charge of the political direction of the conflict, and as Minister of Defense, as the head of the military, essentially. Adopting a far more hands-on role than, as he termed it, in the general direction of the war. So with this in mind, with these two roles, first and foremost, Churchill's role in Operation Overlord was quite significant. He was aware of all the details of the planning, and that ranged from the very elaborate deception plan that successfully convinced the Germans that the main Allied effort would fall not on the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy, but the far more logical location of the Pas-de-Calais, that northern part of France where the gap across the English Channel is but 20 miles. And successful deception plans in military history often focus less on persuading your enemy to think something he does not think already, but more to know what it is that he would do in your shoes, and then convince him that that is what you are going to do. The Germans, and anyone looking at an atlas, knows that the narrowest part of the channel is the Pas-de-Calais. The shortest route to Berlin from northern France is in a roughly easterly line there. So Churchill is very aware of that. Churchill is also keenly aware of the political ramifications of the Allied landings, the price of failure, as we talked about just now, the absolute need to relieve pressure on the Russians on the Eastern Front and to open that second front, something that Marshal Stalin had been advocating from the British and the Americans for a long time. So Churchill is very involved with Overlord. He knows about the many myriad implications of success and failure. He's concerned about the impact also of the likely large numbers of civilian casualties that could or would be incurred by the necessary heavy bombing of the beaches, the defenses around the beaches, as well as towns and cities in that part of France where major railways and arterial communication routes intersected. So Churchill, as Prime Minister and as Minister of Defense, is keenly aware of the implications and the need to plan for all ramifications across that full spectrum, from the most tactical on the beaches to the bigger strategic considerations. Churchill comments on a couple of occasions that we still need to be friends with France, and France needs to be an ally. After this war is over, masses of French civilian casualties would not help with that. And Churchill also contributes to some of the tactical successes. Winston Churchill, throughout his long life, was always an individual who embraced the possibility and the potential of new technology. Wasn't always exactly spot on in how it might be employed, but he was always enthusiastic for new ideas and new inventions. And in fact, as First Lord of the Admiralty early on in World War I, he oversaw and sponsored the creation and the employment of vehicles that became what we now know as tanks. So is Winston Churchill the father of the tank? Well, not quite, possibly the midwife of the idea. So he's certainly an individual who, for all his claims about being a Victorian, he's thinking very much ahead of the situation. And specifically with Overlord, Churchill's patronage of a British Army general, a controversial general somewhat, an individual named Percy Hobart. Churchill sponsors his 79th Armored Division and encourages Hobart to deploy a whole range of specially modified armored vehicles to be used originally and exclusively for employment on the Normandy beaches. Some of those were such as flail tanks, which were a regular British tank, often a Churchill, with a rotating axle well ahead of the vehicle itself that literally flailed heavy chains around in advance of the tank's forward motion, with the idea that they would detonate anti-tank mines well before the tank itself got on top of them. This division also pioneered the use of duplex drive flotation devices for Sherman tanks, allowing them to be released from landing ships well in advance of the beaches, not requiring the tanks to touch down and then swim their way into shore. And these were deployed on the 6th of June with some success, although a lot of casualties as well. So Churchill very much involved in all aspects of this monumental undertaking. How long does it take to plan? Well, a significant amount of time. Discussions really about how the Allies should return to Nazi-occupied Europe to liberate begin very early on. The US joins the war in December of 1941, and as early as January, February 1942, the Allies are thinking about what is necessary to, as I said, return to continental Europe. There are a number of different plans. Operation Bolero is the build-up of Allied forces in Britain, begun very early on in 1942. Operation Sledgehammer is the initial thoughts about establishing an early beachhead in occupied Europe. This grows into Operation Roundup, in which far more substantial beachheads were to be taken in France, and this eventually becomes Operation Overlord, far more ambitious, substantial beachheads secured in France, from which Allied armies would break out and drive ultimately to Berlin. And the size of this plan, the scale of the planning was, of course, enormous.
Wow. You shared with us some of Churchill's thinking leading up to this, but obviously there must have been much debate between the Allies, the US, the UK, the USSR, about where to mount a cross-channel attack. What were some of the competing ideas in this regard?
Well, you're absolutely right, Linda. Sitting in London or sitting in Washington, D.C., with the idea that Nazi Germany has to be halted, destroyed, Western Europe, Eastern Europe liberated, where do you begin? Ever since we'll call it the ignominious retreat, if you like, of the British from France in the early days of the war, the Dunkirk evacuation in May 1940, that sees several 100,000 British troops evacuated from Europe, together with a sizable component of French troops who go on to form that kernel of the Free French Forces under de Gaulle. There'd been a belief that at some juncture there absolutely would need to be a return to the mainland of occupied Europe in a fashion that was significantly substantial to liberate the nations of occupied Europe. And Churchill, of course, who comes to power as Prime Minister on the 10th of May, the very day in which the Germans shift their attentions from Poland in the east, which brought the British and French into the war originally, to France and the Low Countries. How might that happen was a question that was prominent in Churchill's mind, and for the longest time there was no ready answer. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 41, followed swiftly by the German declaration of war on the United States, of course, helps bring a more ready answer to that question. The US, of course, as you know, had been supporting the British through Lend-Lease and a whole host of other arrangements to help the war effort, keep the British in the war. Formal declarations of war by the Germans against against the United States, and obviously by Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, brings the United States unambiguously to the side of the United Kingdom. So the entry of the US into the war really helps provide a far more ready answer to that question. But when to strike as well as where, subject of much debate. And also within the broader strategic debate too was the question of whether the United States, at war like the British against Germany and Japan, should concentrate efforts against which of those two opponents. In terms of the public mind, it is the Japanese, of course, who have struck so egregiously, so viciously against the United States in December of 41. In some sense, the public mood would have perhaps been behind prosecuting the war against the Japanese first. But in large part, this question had been answered well before the war breaks out against these two powers. And in fact, US military planning in the interwar years had considered just such an eventuality and had always prioritized the threat of Germany above that of Japan. And the Germany first strategy, however, was pretty much solidified. However, the implied threat on occasion deployed by the likes of Chief of Staff of the United States Army, George Marshall, to refocus US efforts not on Germany, but on Japan, often allowed Marshall and others to exert an influence over Winston Churchill and the British when there were disagreements about when and where. In early August of 1942, the British and Canadians attempted a landing on the French coast at Dieppe. Famous ambitious effort to seize the port of Dieppe to demonstrate really how easy or how hard it would be for a more substantial landing. It was far more difficult than they imagined. Efforts to seize those port facilities really brought home the enormity of that challenge and the scale of what lay ahead in terms of trying to land a vastly more substantial force on a heavily defended enemy coastline. Really was came home very, very fully, and a lot of British and Canadian casualties. So the US, however, was very keen to land a lot earlier than the British, even perhaps in 1943. Winston Churchill and the British chiefs of staff were adamant that that was way too early. Several concerns. The British had just been essentially defeated on continental Europe by the Germans in 1940. Concerns about the experience and the ability of the US Army initially. A lot of considerations about the ability again to maintain enough fighting power and a logistical chain robust enough to maintain armies of the magnitude needed to defeat the Germans. So landings in North Africa in 1942 and landings in Sicily and subsequently the sort of mainland of Italy all allowed the Allies to gain an expertise, a degree of comfort with amphibious landings well before Operation Overlord.
So how would you describe Churchill's relationship with the American leadership like FDR, Eisenhower, and Marshall?
Churchill generally had very good relations with all the key US leaders. He and FDR had a very special and very close bond. One of the closest, I think, of political leaders in modern times, perhaps the only one in terms of Anglo-American sentiment that comes closest, perhaps Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, some 40-odd years later. FDR and Churchill worked very well together, worked very closely together. As FDR's health deteriorated, however, and as the denouement, if you like, of the war came closer, Churchill certainly felt the relationship between him and FDR, which was a key strategic consideration, was perhaps less strong. And certainly I think Churchill was disappointed somewhat that as Stalin became, and as the Russians became more of a key part in a tripartite effort to prosecute the war against Nazi Germany, that a stronger Anglo-American front against Stalin's ambitions in Eastern Europe would have been a preference, and Churchill, I think, was disappointed somewhat in that. Churchill had a good relationship with key US generals, key US leaders. General Marshall and he initially disagreed, quarreled about when that cross-channel invasion, cross-channel attack should happen. Eventually came to be somewhat of the same mind, and as you noted, Linda, prior to my moving to the Pritzker Museum and Library, I spent some time in Virginia as the president of the George C. Marshall Foundation, a wonderful organization created in the 1950s at the behest of President Truman to ensure that Marshall, a great American, was not forgotten to history. Marshall, a terribly self-effacing individual, the antithesis of Winston Churchill in so many ways. There's lots of apposite Churchill quotations. Churchill, of course, as you know, and I'm sure all your audience know, once said that history shall be kind to me, for I intend to write that history. And Churchill's magisterial 6-volume history of World War II does just that. A man like Marshall, who was very reticent to profit from public office, whether as Chief of Staff of the Army or as Secretary of State, never writes his own biography or never writes an autobiography, although there's a very good authorized biography. But Churchill and Marshall are very close. Churchill talks of Marshall and terms him the true organizer of victory in World War II. His efforts to focus US industry on war production, for the way in which he oversaw the growth of the United States Army that in 1939, I think, ranked 14th largest in the world, behind that of Portugal. And Marshall is largely responsible for seeing the United States Army grow to nearly 8 million men, 11 million men and women in uniform in World War II at the end of that conflict. And Marshall is very key to all of that. Churchill also very impressed by General Eisenhower. They have a good relationship. Churchill meets Eisenhower well in advance of that decision to see Eisenhower named as the Overlord commander, sees him in June or May or June of 1942, I think, United States, when he's observing maneuvers. He calls him a true American eagle. Churchill, of course, has a profound respect and admiration for the United States. His mother is an American. He likes to term himself the product of an Anglo-American relationship, which of course is literally true as well as figuratively true. And so he in a sense, he's the embodiment of that relationship. So not always smooth, not always seamless in terms of priorities, but Winston Churchill certainly treasured that relationship with FDR, undoubtedly.
That's great. Let's turn back to D-Day just a little bit now. Is it true that Churchill had planned to be part of the D-Day invasion?
Incredibly, it is true. Winston Churchill had verbalized his intent to be physically present on the morning of Operation Overlord, whether that had been the 5th of June or the 6th of June. Not obviously to land on the beaches in that first wave, or indeed to drop in as part of the airborne assault, obviously, but he wanted to be there. And Winston Churchill, we think of him today as Prime Minister in World War II, appropriately so, and we think of him as we'll call him the generously proportioned man that he was in that time, and as a politician. But as a younger man, he is a man of action. Junior officer in the British Army at the beginning of his career, part of the 4th Hussars, as a temporarily attached officer with the 21st Lancers. Winston Churchill had been part of one of the last great cavalry charges of the British Army at the Battle of Omdurman in the Sudan in 1898. So Churchill has seen combat and seen action on very many occasions. Churchill, post the Battle of Omdurman, famously commented that in his estimation, nothing in life is so exhilarating as to be shot at without result. I mean, he was very, very proud of that. So Churchill's a man of action, and wanting to be there on the day is absolutely in line with his and well within the bounds of his character, if you like. Churchill had hoped to see the landings from on board the British cruiser HMS Belfast, and then possibly to venture ashore at some indeterminate point. Needless to say, the likes of Alan Brooke, British Chief of Staff, and others were dismayed by this possibility. They did their best to dissuade Churchill, underscore the fundamental inadvisability of him being anywhere near the front. Eventually, they are required to persuade the King George, to intervene directly to dissuade Churchill. They managed to do, the King himself has to put in a telephone call to Churchill, and in the end has to write 2 handwritten notes to firmly persuade Churchill to not be present. And there's a couple of reasons why everybody thought it was a dreadful idea. Firstly, it would have been dangerous, and to have the Prime Minister exposed in that fashion made no sense. Also, they also knew that the chances of Churchill not intervening and meddling and giving orders in the middle of proceedings would have been extremely high. And one of the key skills of leadership is to empower your subordinates and let the professionals do what they need to do. And Churchill, in the midst of all that, would have undoubtedly not been able to resist meddling, if you like, or issuing orders, and especially if events did not go the way in which everyone had hoped them to be. And it was a tremendous gamble. So yes, Churchill wanted to be there, had to be strongly, forcibly, almost dissuaded from being there. Churchill gets to Normandy reasonably swiftly, D-Day +6. So 6 days later, the 12th of June, Churchill is on the beaches. And a lot of great movie footage of that time. Churchill doing what he does best, inspiring, and being at the center of things.
Thank you. We know that D-Day was the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. What were Churchill's views on a post-war world?
Winston Churchill, throughout his long career, and he's born in 1874 and he dies in 1965. So it's a very long career in the public eye in one form or another. A lot of works on paper. We know a lot about what he thought, and he is mostly an optimist about the future. But he greatly feared that the post-war world, if you like, was going to be not necessarily the one that Britain had gone to war to preserve in 1939, and that Poland, the state of Poland especially, that of course, as we all know, was the principal and the immediate catalyst for Britain and France's declaration of war in 1939. He was concerned that Poland, having escaped the Nazis or been liberated from the Nazis, may well simply exchange one foreign power for another. In this case, the domination of exchange ruled by Hitler for rule by Stalin and the Soviet Union. And of course, as things pan out, that's essentially what happens. Churchill is a man of his time. He is an ardent imperialist, which caused a lot of those bumps in the road, if you like, between FDR and Churchill, and there were many. FDR is no fan of the British Empire. Winston Churchill is the apotheosis of fans of the British Empire, believes the British Empire is a great force for good. And so he is very concerned that the British Empire emerged from World War II in a fashion that will allow its preservation. Some of the delays about thinking about where the Allied landing should be in Normandy are in part derailed by Churchill's belief that a Mediterranean strategy, fighting the enemy in a peripheral fashion around the Mediterranean, was the best way to go. He'd, of course, been a big fan of this in World War I. That led directly to the landings at Gallipoli on the Dardanelles Peninsula, when Churchill believed that the soft underbelly of Europe was a way to defeat the Central Powers, knock the Turks out of the war, pressure the Austro-Hungarians, who would in turn collapse, then pressure Imperial Germany. Wanted to repeat something similar in World War II, but in part that was out of the belief that the Mediterranean was Britain's sphere of influence, and that heading the Russians off, the Soviet Union, in the Mediterranean too was an absolute necessity. So the future had an impact on the present in World War II. Churchill, of course, would only see out the war in Europe as prime minister. Churchill, within weeks really of the VE Day, the surrender on the 8th, formal surrender on 8th of May 1945 of Germany, Churchill is defeated in the July 1945 general election, and he is then relegated to the role of leader of the opposition, not prime minister, and Clement Attlee, the Labour leader, and Churchill's wartime deputy prime minister, who had served as part of a coalition, he is prime minister when the Japanese surrender. So Churchill has the best of hopes for the future, for the post-war world, if you like, but he knows there are going to be challenges, and the biggest challenges that he can see on the horizon are the Soviet Union. Winston Churchill, in the days and months after the Russian Revolution, had sent British troops to fight in the Russian Civil War as part of the interventionist forces. The United States does so similarly, and Churchill had famously claimed that he wanted to strangle Bolshevism at birth. So he's a lifelong opponent of communism and of Bolshevism. The war had demanded that Winston Churchill make an ally of Stalin. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, so to speak. And Churchill famously commented that had the Nazis invaded hell, he, Winston Churchill, would have at least made a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. And he this sort of quantified or clarified or summed up his thought about the alliance with the Soviet Union. But he's very worried about the Russians, very worried about Stalin. Out of office, in the post-war world, of course, Winston Churchill makes virtue out of a necessity, and as you all probably know, journeys to Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, to deliver one of the most significant speeches of his career, personal invitation by the president of the college, and a nice handwritten note by President Truman on the bottom of that invitation that says, "This is a great school in my home state," Truman, a Missourian, of course, "please say you'll do it," i.e. deliver the address, "I'll introduce you." And so Winston Churchill, no longer prime minister, but an MP, and still cognizant, as he sees it, of the nascent threat of the Soviet Union, goes to Fulton, Missouri, in the heartland of the United States, delivers a speech formally entitled "The Sinews of Peace," but best known, I'm sure, to everyone as the Iron Curtain speech, when he says that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. He lays out fundamentally his unambiguous concern about the post-war world, and that Nazis are defeated, Hitler's dead, but Joseph Stalin and communism has taken its place as the big threat to civilization and to democracy. And of course, the Cold War that Churchill articulates or enunciates in 1946 in Fulton, Missouri at Westminster College becomes the reality of international relations for some 40-odd years. So Churchill, and your question was a good one, what are his views on the post-war world? Much opportunity. He's a big fan of what the United Nations, a nascent body, can promise. Churchill talks about the way in which Europe should and could come together as a United States of Europe in some fashion, although I'm not sure the EU was exactly what he was thinking. But he sees a great deal of potential, but he also sees threats, and in some ways the worst case scenario does come out to a certain extent. But Churchill is always looking ahead no matter what the situation.
So I'm noticing the time, and I wish I could continue to ask you questions, but I want to save a little time for our audience to be able to ask what's on their mind. But before I turn you over to my colleague, Matthew Sacco, to raise the community questions, if you would, for those that are unfamiliar with the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, would you take a few minutes and tell us about your mission and how you fulfill it and what you have planned for the future?
Thank you, Linda. I would be delighted. Pritzker Military Museum and Library is a wonderful institution in Chicago. We are located at 104 South Michigan at the junction of Michigan and Monroe Street. Founded by Colonel Jennifer Pritzker in 2003, initially just as a library in another part of the city, and then moved 2011, 2012 to the fabulous Monroe building, where we occupy 3 floors of library space, museum space, and also have a wonderful television studio. And we have pre-COVID, and we will go back to this, weekly programs with authors, panel discussions, many of them broadcast on WTTW across Chicagoland. And in the future, we have arrangements and ambitions to see our programs broadcast across the country in other public television markets. So the mission is to provide programs and to preserve the 3-dimensional artifacts and writings of that speak to the experience of the citizen soldier. So what we look at is really the experience of those who have donned uniforms, men or women, whatever branch of the military, across US history, from the very beginning of the Revolutionary War to the present day. And we have a wonderful library collection. We have a wonderful 3-dimensional collection. And this grew initially from Colonel Pritzker's own career-long service with the United States Army and Illinois National Guard, and a belief on the part of Colonel Pritzker that if we all believe, as we should in a democracy, that the military should be subject to civilian control and command, how can we expect civilians to make good decisions about the military and and a defense budget that is sizable if we have little understanding about who the military is, why those who serve in the military do serve, and what their role is. So we like to think of ourselves as a bit of a bridging point between the military and the civilian world. And in addition to our many programs on history and talking about the past, and we also spend a lot of time talking about the present. Chiefs of Staff of the Army, Chiefs of Naval Operations come to the Pritzker Military Museum for programs open to the public, really to talk about your Army and your Navy and your Air Force. And in doing so, break down that divide between the civilian and the military. At a time in US history when less than 1% of the population pulls on that uniform, I'd like to think, or we like to think, that is an important role. And at the moment, we're obviously closed. We've had a wonderful virtual series of events. Pritzker Military presents on the home front, a lot of virtual engagement, a lot of good stuff on our website, pritzkermilitary.org. And we will be back in the office, hopefully next week in limited form. We will return bigger and better. And our current exhibition, appropriately, is called The Allied Road to Victory, that looks at the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe and in the Far East. The exhibition will be up till the end of the year and is available to view virtually on our website, which is pritzkermilitary.org. So please come and take a look and join us in person when we all return to the office at some juncture.
Oh, I haven't been there yet. I'm going to look forward to coming down and visiting you.
We'd love to see you.
This has been really a fabulous learning experience, and I do want to turn the program over to Matthew so that he can give voice to some of the questions that our audience has asked. But before I turn off my camera, I just want to thank you again for being with us today. It's been fabulous.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Matthew.
Hello and good afternoon. My name is Matthew Sacco, and I'm the Associate Manager of Education at the Illinois Holocaust Museum. And I will be taking questions that have been sent in chat. I'll try to get to all of the questions. However, I've been sent dozens of them, but we will try to get through to this. The first question that I'd like to ask is, why do you think that Winston Churchill has so much meaning 75 years after liberation?
That is a very good. That is a very good question. Winston Churchill has an enduring fascination for so many people. Why is that? He's a fascinating individual. He's a man of many parts. He's an artist, he's an author, he's a soldier, he's a politician, he's a leader. He seems to speak to so many aspects of human endeavor that there is always something from his long life that anyone can find resonance with. I think one of the things that is the most enduring is that, I'm paraphrasing slightly, there was a great description of Winston Churchill that talked about how he made himself. He was an unassured public speaker as a young man. He wasn't a great scholar. He struggled to pass the entrance examinations into the British, what was then the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, now the Royal Military Academy. But largely, he spoke with a slight lisp. But through sheer willpower and application, he made himself the man he was, which was the leader of World War II that we're all familiar with, and a man responsible for so many other things. So I think the enduring fascination of a Winston Churchill is that there is an example for all of us in Winston Churchill. Application, courage, determination. Churchill is born into a life that has a lot of advantages, but he makes the most of them, and he mitigates his many weaknesses, and I think that is an inspiration. He's also a man from the past. He claimed, even at the time that he was a Victorian, that his opinions were from another century. 50 plus years after his death, he's in many ways almost more remote in terms of his opinions, but that confidence in himself is inspirational, I would like to think, not just for our time, but for all time.
Fantastic, thank you. We've had several questions that kind of revolve around the same issue, so I'm going to kind of consolidate all of them. So it's going to be a part one, part two sort of a deal. John asks, did Stalin know in advance of the landing, and how much did Churchill and Roosevelt trust him? And part two of that question was, how did they pull this off with no leaks?
Very good questions. Yes, and Stalin absolutely knows that the Allied landings are going to come. I'm reasonably sure he knows exactly where and when. Within days of the Allied landings in Normandy, the Russians launched something called Operation Bagration, which is a massive assault on German forces on the Eastern Front, results in the destruction of an entire German army group center. So there was a lot of working together in that fashion. And Stalin had been insistent about the absolute need for the Western Allies to launch an assault to take the pressure off the Russians in the Eastern Front somewhere sooner than later. So he's been insistent on that. And the Allies know that unless they do something reasonably quickly, potentially the Russians will roll through Germany, and who knows where they'll stop. And those concerns about the post-war world will be realized, and it'll be a Russian-dominated Europe, communist-dominated Europe, not a German and Nazi one. Yeah, how do they manage to pull it off without any sizable leaks? It is pretty amazing that the Germans are fooled pretty much up to the last moment as to where the landings are going to come. Looking back, it is incredible that they do not know more. The Allies have been very successful in a counterintelligence operation. Very few German spies have been are still active in Britain and in the US. Very successful operations by British security services in rolling up espionage networks from the very beginning of the war. But the knowledge does not get out in any substantial fashion. The Germans are on alert across the whole coastline, but a lot of it speaks to the success of Operation Fortitude, the deception plan that is terribly persuasive. General Patton, who the Germans, and going back to my earlier point about never try and persuade your enemy to think something he doesn't think, just know what he thinks and exaggerate that, and you can, while he's focused on that, the Germans believe the best Allied general is Patton. Why do they think that? Because he fights like the German generals. So Patton is in charge of a much publicized first US Army group in the southeast of England, right across the Pas-de-Calais, and the Germans are persuaded that where else would you put your best general if not in the place where you're going to launch the invasion from? There's lots of fake radio traffic, huge military encampments that are essentially inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic. There's the well-known story about the decomposing corpse that is left floating in the Mediterranean with top secret plans strapped to his wrist in a briefcase secured with handcuffs that talk about a landing in the Pas-de-Calais. Just very, very good counterintelligence activities. And the Germans, as we know, are fooled largely. And even after the landings on the 6th of June, some time before they realize that this is not just a feint. You know, sitting here in the 21st century, 2020, when nothing seems to stay secret for very long, it is incredible to think how secure this was. I'm always minded about those who worked at the Bletchley Park code-breaking operation in the United Kingdom. Many Americans there as well. A lot of these people were sworn to secrecy and went to their graves and never revealed a single thing. And it's a generational thing, I think, in part, that people took these things terribly seriously. And when you're engaged in a fight for civilization, and I mean, the British, of course, have a whole tranche of spies in the secret services passing things on to the Russians, but the Germans do not seem to be able to penetrate that. Hopefully that's a bit of an answer to those two very good questions.
Amazing. And now I'm going to take you to the other end of the alphabet. Winston Churchill was so fantastic. Why did he lose the election after the war?
Well, that is one of the big questions, especially for US audiences. How is it that the man who wins the war can be so unceremoniously booted out the first chance the British electorate get? The reasons for that are in part grounded in what I just said, that Churchill is seen very much as a man who is cometh the hour, cometh the man. Churchill's a war leader. The peace will be very different. Winston Churchill and the Conservative Party are in coalition with the major British political parties. They focus, the Conservatives, as part of that coalition, focus on international considerations. The Labour Party, party to the left, are largely focused as part of that coalition with domestic arrangements. So the British people see Labour politicians on a daily basis involved in their daily lives. And the British mobilized society in a fashion unprecedented in British history. And everything is focused on winning the war. And when the Labour Party dissolved the coalition in the aftermath of VE Day and insists that now is the time for a general election, Churchill disagrees pretty substantially. He says we should wait until the Japanese are defeated. The coalition government is working so well, we should keep it going. But the Labour Party's adamant it's time for a general election. And the Labour Party essentially put to the British people the most persuasive argument, I think, in British electoral history, which is we have won the war using methods of mobilizing the population. We will, in peace, use those same methods to win the peace, and everyone's lives will be better. And for the British, the spectre of World War I is not terribly far removed. After two major global conflagrations in the space of a couple of generations, peace and the prospect of that are what people are voting for. And Churchill, so focused on winning the war, has had very little time to think about what the peace looks like. Although he sponsors many committees and plans and programs for what it could look like, he's not seen as the leader of that. Linda mentioned that I was at the Churchill Museum in Fulton, Missouri, there because, of course, of Churchill's Iron Curtain address. We put a new exhibition in 2006, the 60th anniversary of Churchill's visit to Westminster College there, and his last surviving daughter, Mary Soames, walked around with me before she cut the ribbon on the new exhibition, and we had a great video presentation that looked at why it was that Churchill lost that general election. And she said to me candidly, she said, my father had spent 5 years being a leader. When it came to it, in July of 45, he had forgotten how to be a politician, which I thought was the best encapsulation, in summary, of how it is, or how it was, that Winston Churchill managed to lose that general election, because it seems incredible, even, you know, looking back 75 years or so, and especially from the vantage point of the US population, how could that be? But a lot of good reasons why he did.
Thank you so much. There were many, many good questions, but at this time, I would like to thank you, Dr. Havers. Many thanks for this terrific session, and thank you everyone who attended today's program. Quickly, a few brief announcements. We want to encourage you to join us next week for 2 more outstanding programs. On Wednesday, June 10th, is a special virtual commemoration, the 155th anniversary of Juneteenth, marking the ending of slavery in the United States. An evening with Sherilyn Ifill, President and Co-Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And Friday, if you enjoyed this program, another lunch and learn, Winston Churchill and the Jews, Zionism, Holocaust, and the Lessons for the 20th Century, a talk by Lee Pollock. He's a trustee and advisor to the board of the International Churchill Society. That's next Friday at noon. You'll find a link to the registration on our events page that'll be posted in our chat box. Linda has posted that for everybody. And finally, there is a link in the chat box for a program survey. And we'd really appreciate it if you would take a moment to fill out the survey. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And again, a huge thank you to Dr. Havers for being here with us this afternoon.
My pleasure.
And that concludes our program for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you again at our next program.